if you take out the things that allow people from all over the world to come and successfully integrate in this society, if you make it so difficult for people to have housing, to have daycare, to have health care, to have quality education for their kids, then you're pushing in an opposite direction. And as I was looking at all these things happen, I felt I had to kind of sound an alarm, so it became not just an accounting of good things that I had been observing that were happening, telling those stories, but it also became a question of advocacy.
So, show of hands, who's read this book already? Ooh, okay. Well, we're selling them at the back, so that's great. It is a fantastic book in so many ways. It is a gorgeous follow-up to Ken's 2011 highly acclaimed book, Walking Home, which showcases the rejuvenation of many cities throughout the world that Ken worked on. And, I've always wondered that Ken could have chosen any of these cities to put down roots. But it's our great fortune that he has chosen Toronto as his home. So this follow-up book, in some ways, I see as the love letter to Toronto. It tracks some of the most important projects and changes in the city that have shaped the arc of success for Toronto. So I'm curious, my first question to Ken is, going back to the fact that you've worked in many cities, I'm curious why Toronto, what you saw in Toronto back then, and what motivated you now to write this specific book about Toronto at this particular moment?
So, Cherise, it's a bunch of things that kind of came together. I was watching the city transform, and the book is actually like a series of short stories about particular places. I'm an urban designer, so one of my lenses is the physical world, and I was fascinated by how in different parts of our city change was occurring, how it was happening, who was involved in it, and we're not terribly good in Toronto at telling those stories. And so while all this was going on, I wanted to capture that and capture this moment of the last couple of decades while these things were happening. But the real motivation actually was a bigger issue. There were two things that came to the forefront in Toronto for me that together created a situation that is quite unique in the world, and that's what I wanted to capture. And those two are an astonishing growth spurt. We're growing faster than the next three fastest growing cities in North America. And the second is who we are, and the fact that we are the most diverse city in the planet, that over 50% of us identify as visible minorities. That fact itself is not so unusual. What's unusual is that we are experiencing that in a way that is different from almost everybody else. And I'm not even sure I need the almost. If you look south of the border, they're tearing themselves to pieces over immigration and over a fear of the other. If you look at the UK, Brexit is largely about a reaction to those Polish workers who are taking our jobs away. But, I'm being funny, but it's about otherness. If you look at pretty much every European country, there is an established anti-immigrant party which actually has credibility. And Maxime Bernier, to the contrary, we don't really have that in Canada, and I don't think we will. And so I saw in that something very special, and of course, the welcome that we extend to the world, our reputation for being a welcoming city, is the reason why everybody wants to come here. So these two things are mutually reinforcing. It's leading us to play a lead role in the world. We have something to prove that is different from what everyone else is going through. With that comes a great burden and a responsibility, and it's being expressed in facts on the ground, the way different parts of the city are transforming. So there was this great promise, I came to believe, of Toronto being at this point in history, in its history, what I was calling a city for all. And that became the kind of plot line of the book. Can we truly live up to that expectation and be a city for all?
Great. And so it's a very optimistic book. But Ken, we know that when you were just about to go to publishing with this book, something happened. Doug Ford was just in the process of slashing city council, and he was about, there was a wave of cuts and provincial cuts and takeovers that were about to take effect. So you felt compelled to go back to, you're about to publish it, you felt compelled to go back and rewrite the foreword to reflect this. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I had actually turned in the manuscript and they were ready to start rolling the presses. And then the provincial election happened and we literally had a tsunami of shocking things. The first was slashing the council in half without any involvement from Torontonians, but then a succession of attacks on education, on healthcare, on daycare, on kids with autism, on the French University, on post-secondary education in the 905. It just went on and on and on. It seemed like every day, and in fact it continues to this day, there were things that were challenging my basic premise. Because in order for the promise that I had identified to actually be fulfilled, that city for all that I was hoping and imagining that we were becoming, if you take out the things that allow people from all over the world to come and successfully integrate in this society, if you make it so difficult for people to have housing, to have daycare, to have healthcare, to have quality education for their kids, then you're pushing in an opposite direction. And as I was looking at all these things happen, I felt I had to kind of sound an alarm, so it became not just an accounting of good things that I had been observing that were happening, telling those stories, but it also became a question of advocacy, of sounding an alert and saying, we have to be really careful or we're going to lose something precious. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was an underlying pattern to all these things that were being attacked. It seemed almost random. But in fact, I realized it wasn't random. And what it is doing is attacking an idea about the city, which was 180 degrees off the idea that I was describing. To be sure, it's not about the budget. It's not about the deficit. It's not about the money. It's about a vision of what a city is, that instead of seeing it as a collectivity where we solve problems together, which is what my whole book was about. It was about people getting together to solve all manner of challenges, how we transform streets, how we transform neighborhoods, our reconciliation with nature in a time of climate change, how we create public spaces. The underlying driving force for all these things coming from Queen's Park was really picking up on Margaret Thatcher's famous quote, "There is no such thing as society." And if you believe that, then you see the city not as a collectivity, you see it as a collection of atomized individuals and households. And what you try and do is cut back on everything public and send people to private solutions. And that is, I have to say, it's a very American idea. And Doug Ford spent a long time in Chicago, as you know, and I think he was sitting there in Chicago marinating over this and thinking, if I get my chance, I'm going to come back and remake the province of Ontario, and in the process remake Toronto, which he saw as the antithesis in this model. So let me give you an example. Why? I'll give you two. And we're hearing the same discourse, albeit in a slightly less crude way, at the federal level right now. So the idea that you're going to put money in people's pockets as opposed to give them services, what does that mean? It means babysitting instead of daycare. It means you cut back on the quality of education, public education. You take away the courses that have made our education system so productive. You enlarge the classes. You take away arts, culture, recreation, sports. So what happens? Middle-class people take their kids out of the public schools, and they do what Americans do in large numbers, which is to send their kids to private schools. And I think that is really what's going on here, that whether it's healthcare or daycare or education or pretty much any of the underpinnings of an equitable society that are crucial to enable our great experiment of being this different place in the world that embraces difference and takes advantage of it in ways that we have been doing. If you take away those props, you put it at risk.
Now, the last time that we checked, Doug Ford is not that popular in the polls. So the question I have then is, this is about a year now. It's been about a year since this wave of cuts, since you were completing this book. Do you feel like you're retaining that optimism that you had when you wrote that book? Is Doug Ford, is this stuff going to stick to Toronto? Is it going to have a lasting impact? Or do you think we will rise above it because of who we are in Toronto, what we've done? And in some ways, do you think there's a silver lining? Has it brought council closer together? Are we getting things done like we haven't before? I'd love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I've had to think really long and hard about that. Is this set of body blows that we're experiencing, is it fatal? Is it going to so drastically undermine our great experiment that we won't be able to recover from it? Or, I don't know if I would go so far as to say a silver lining, but is there a way out of this? And I'm seeing a few things happen. One, of course, is I take some solace from the reaction in the polls, because I don't think there'll be a second term. A lot of damage has been done, but a lot of that is reversible. And in fact, we're seeing the government backtrack on a lot of things already because they're so deeply unpopular. But I also feel we now have a critical mass within our population, a human capital that we have assembled from all over the world of people who are actually committed to each other and to this place that is so powerful that it can't easily be undone. And I see that especially among young people. I see civil society stepping up, stepping into the breach in many cases, filling in the gaps for the moment. I don't see us in an inevitable push to that American view of life, liberty, and the pursuit of, in my parentheses, individual happiness. I think we're actually going to retain the notion of peace, order, and good government. And by the way, the original term before the BNA Act was peace, welfare, and good government, before welfare was made a dirty word by the likes of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I want to dive into some of the details of this book now because, as you said, it's a collection of stories, of amazing success stories that have shaped Toronto. And one of them I want to talk a little bit about is the Kings, what's called the Kings Project, which really is one of your great legacies. And it was regenerating a part of downtown Toronto, two shoulders of King and Spadina and King and Parliament, which at the time were underutilized, a lot of parking lots, and it was revitalized into an amazing, vibrant, mixed-use community just by changing the zoning. So can you explain to this audience why this project, maybe a little bit of background about this project, but why it was so important to Toronto's success, and what is the most important lesson from this successful rezoning?
Well, I'll come back to the lessons because like any great experiment, you learn about things that worked and other things you might do differently. So I'm going to say a few words about that in a moment. But how did this come about? When Barbara Hall was elected in 1994, she convened a little ginger group to come into City Hall, which included Jane Jacobs and myself, a developer called Bobby Eisenberg, an economist called Gary Stamm, Paul Bedford, who was then the chief planner of the city, and we sat around a table, and Barbara was kind of saying, as newly elected mayors often do, wow, I've won the election, what can I do? What might be a special legacy project that I can undertake? And we batted it around for a while, and we decided, and honestly, I can't remember exactly how this took shape, but essentially was to take a page from Jane Jacobs' great book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she made these very interesting observations about what happens in a city when you have a mix of people living, working, shopping, mixed use, essentially, as we now describe it, and radical mixed use. And so we had these two shoulders of downtown that had been industrial powerhouses for the city. The industry had departed through some combination of industrial obsolescence, globalization, move out to the suburbs, and the city was desperately holding on to industrial zoning, which meant you weren't allowed to use those buildings or sites for anything but industry. You couldn't even legally do office buildings, contemporary office space. And as a result, because the factories were not coming back into that wonderful stock of buildings, the owners were tearing them down to make parking lots, because that's the only way they could actually benefit from the buildings. A lot of them were simply empty. There were a few squatters here and there, but not to any great extent. And so we came up with the idea of what if we simply removed land use zoning altogether? If we simply let people do whatever they wanted to do with those buildings, subject to, we weren't getting glue factories, we weren't getting things that were emitting toxic fumes, and by the way, there was provincial legislation that dealt with issues of toxicity or damage. And so it was basically applying a sunset provision, saying we have accumulated this unhelpful prohibition on letting the city exercise its ingenuity, and all of the hundreds, and it turned out thousands of actors in the city who could take advantage of this new possibility. And that began the great experiment of the Kings. And in 20 years, we got 50,000 housing units with no expenditure of public money. And here's the most remarkable thing. We have more people working in King Parliament and King Spadina today than ever did at the height of the industrial era. And both those things happened simultaneously. And along with that, we got all kinds of other things. So Jane Jacobs used to come and visit my wife Etty and myself. We were in the first legal new residential building that was built in King Spadina. And she would come, sit on the balcony, look over what was happening, where all this activity was going on, and she was just fascinated to see how this was all playing out. And so were we, because we got to a point where month after month, year after year, there were just all these amazing new things coming to pass within this area, to the point where this has become kind of an example in the world of releasing the energy of the city to do positive things. And I've now coined a term for this. It's called subtractive urbanism. Subtract the bad laws and let the city be the city.
Okay, I'm going to jump in on this because that's a great term. And I love also how it's described in the book as a radical plan. So I'm curious, what do you think today's subtractive urbanism is? In other words, what is the big policy or zoning change that could shape the next chapter for Toronto? So what needs to be unlocked or fixed or future-proofed? What's the next Kings? If you could do it now, what would it be?
Well, I think we're starting to do a few things very tentatively, following those footsteps. One is laneway suites. We have 250 kilometers of laneways in Toronto. They're an extraordinary asset. And so allowing people to actually build residential units on their own property, rental units of modest scale, which other cities have done as well, and in commercial areas to start businesses, workshops, studios, is an example of, once again, allowing things to happen. I think, and Cherise, you've written a lot about this, the so-called yellow belt. Yellow is the color on planning maps that is typically used for exclusive residential areas, very often single-family areas. And allowing, if you go back to the early part of the 20th century and you go to older neighborhoods, I lived on the beach for many years. If you know the beach, that whole stretch along Queen Street, there are all these little walk-up apartment buildings. There are fourplexes. There's a whole variety of building types, and what that enables is a variety of people to live there. And we somehow got to the idea in the early part of the 20th century that we were going to segregate people by household types, and even worse, by class. So I'm now working in the city of Brampton, and they have a category in their zoning bylaw called executive housing, as if the executives don't want to live near the hoi polloi. So they have bigger lots, and they're in a separate little subdivision, and then you have the single-family detached as an area, and then you have the townhouses as another area. So what that does is it sorts people out by how much money they have. And I think getting rid of all of that paraphernalia and allowing for diversity to creep into all parts of the city. Another thing is the prohibition on people working in a lot of residential areas. So many people now work from home. They have small businesses. And again, like the Kings, they're not harmful. And so enabling people to use their houses. We have now rattling around in big single-family houses a lot of people who, if they had alternatives in their neighborhoods to move into another kind of accommodation, would happily do so, would free up all of those empty bedrooms at a point where we're in a housing crisis. So I think
Yep.
those are a bunch of things we could do on the housing front.
So unlocking those restricted neighborhoods and opening them up to housing. There is a panel following ours which is talking all about affordable housing. So I will restrain on asking a bunch of questions about that because it is a hot topic. I do have one question for you because it kind of relates to the book really tracks this amazing path of success that Toronto is experiencing. And you often hear people say, well, Toronto is a victim of its success. That's what happens when you're a successful global city. Suddenly, housing is unaffordable. Suddenly, real estate is really expensive. It's inevitable. So I'm curious what your viewpoint is on that. Is that, I know it's a number of factors, but I'm curious what you think about that explanation, or is it attributed to more to other things like policy barriers, or even the financialization of housing as an investment or a commodity?
So let me go back to the Kings for a moment to start answering that question. There are a couple of things in retrospect, 3, that I wish we had done a little differently. As well as things have turned out, these would have made a huge difference. One is, had we had inclusionary zoning, if 20% of those 50,000 housing units, if 10,000 of them had been affordable housing scattered throughout King Parliament and King Spadina, that would have housed 40 to 50,000 people who are the people who do all the work in our city, who are forced to live at enormous distances from downtown, so-called workforce housing. That's one thing. And I think we have really missed the boat, but it's never too late. We have to, and by the way, that's one of the things the provincial government has stepped in and said we can't do. The city council was poised to do inclusionary zoning citywide, and the province is now preventing that from happening. Another thing is we should have put even more emphasis on public spaces, public facilities to serve this increased population. I think there was a huge miscalculation on the part of the city and the development industry initially, thinking that young families wouldn't want to live vertically in the heart of the city, and so we didn't have the schools, we didn't have the daycare, the recreation centers, the playgrounds, all the things that you need to support that population. We're playing catch up. In City Place today, we're getting 2 new schools and a community center next to Canoe Landing Park, but it's taken all those years, and the school is way oversubscribed already. City Place which is the area, the former CN railway lands south of the rail corridor, is full of young families with kids. So that's a second. A third is a regulation that we should have kept. And that is, typically there are a couple of ways of controlling development. One of them is height limits, and another is what's called floor space index, FSI, which says, given the area of a lot, how much actual density you can put on the lot. So it could be 2 times the area of the lot, 3 times, 4 times. Naively, we thought, let's just go with height limits and let's give the developers envelopes based on height, within which we imagine creative architects will come up with all kinds of interesting buildings, and we don't want to hamstring them too much by getting too prescriptive. This will not be a problem. Well, what happened is, and I guess we could have imagined this, but we didn't, the speculative land market kicked in. They took the height envelope, so if you had, let's say, a height of 25 meters, the speculators would come along and say, well, we have a lot of X dimension, and we have a height limit of 25 meters, we can just fill up the whole lot with a building 25 meters high, and that's what we're entitled to, which was never the intention. And then they went and hired an architect who said, well, you can't really build a residential building that fills up the whole envelope. We have to have a tower. And then off to the OMB. And so this set off a wave of speculation that got challenged over and over and over. And unfortunately, it kind of got out of control in some areas, and it's hard to contain it. And had we done a simple thing, which is to have both a height limit and a floor space index, we would have put the city in a much stronger position to control development. But back to your original question, Cherise, I think here's what happened globally. Cities became popular again. People, especially young people, fell out of love with the idea of living in distant suburbs and doing long commutes by automobile. And so, all the places that had the ability for people to be near transit, to walk to do their shopping, to have all the services and amenities that they associated with city life that they were looking for became more desirable. So when I came to Toronto in 1968, I lived in the beach, and I moved to the beach shortly after I got here. The residents of the beach, which is now such a popular neighborhood, were selling their properties for almost nothing and moving out to bungalows in Scarborough because they were persuaded that that was the future. And this fantastic neighborhood with the boardwalk on the beach and Queen Street was passé. The city at that time was quite affordable. It was affordable for newcomers like myself and many of my neighbors who were coming from all over the world because it wasn't valued so much by the larger population. Neighborhoods like Riverdale, like the Annex, like all the parts of the city. The Annex was largely rooming houses. A lot of it for students, but also for young people who found an easy place to land. The affordability was because of this, not to the extent that the Americans did, but we had this exodus to the suburbs because that was associated with the good life. Everything flipped. And so everybody wanted to be in the pre-war city, the parts of Toronto that were built prior to World War II that were not built around the automobile that had all these conveniences. So we started to call that gentrification. And gentrification meant, guess what? This huge growing population is all bidding, whether rental or purchase, for the same limited amount of real estate, and the prices go sky high. And that's happening not just in Toronto, it's happening in cities around the world. There are two answers to that. One is, as I said before, the inclusionary zoning. We have to recognize that the private market, left to its own devices, is going to price people out. And the only way to deal with that, in addition to opening up more opportunities, which I was describing before, is to say that a significant percentage of the housing that is created has to be done by taking it off the private market into other forms of housing. Affordable housing, co-ops, all manner of other solutions. Other cities in the world, in the Nordic countries, for example, that's what they do. They are very prosperous. They would have exactly the same phenomenon that we're experiencing of polarization by geography, but for the fact that in the hearts of Stockholm, of Helsinki, of Copenhagen, of Malmö, a very significant portion of the housing that gets built, and that's true, by the way, for German cities, French cities, is not just private market housing, it's a blended mix. The Netherlands, they do the same thing. That's part of it. The other thing that has happened, which exacerbates the problem, and this is a much harder problem to deal with, especially for a city, is precarious employment. And the fact that wages, because everybody now is a contract worker, they don't have benefits, wages have been kept extremely low. We've allowed that to happen as a society. So I just heard in a survey that was done in the last few days that points out that young people and new arrivals to the country are making roughly the same amount of money as people made in 1980. And at the same time, obviously, the cost of living for everything else has gone way up. And this is contributing to a huge disparity in people's purchasing power, and that reflects in all aspects of affordability. And that's somehow the big thing that happened after World War II is that people who had reasonable jobs were paid well enough so that they could lead a good life. And for some reason, we've allowed corporations to create conditions for employment that are frankly exploitative and are taking away all the hard-won gains that people fought for over decades.
Great. I'm getting the 5-minute mark, so I do want to get 2 questions in before we open it up from the floor, so we'll make these really quick. Jumping back into your book, you mentioned the suburbs. I want to talk about the suburbs for a minute. You have a chapter in there dedicated to urbanizing the suburbs, and you talk about Mississauga, which is a project you've been working on. You also, as I know, because I've been with you in Brampton, you're working on revitalizing the downtown of Brampton. So maybe just help us understand as quickly as you can, why are the suburbs suddenly ready for a retrofit? And can you maybe spell out some of, they're not all the same. Maybe help us understand a little bit how, say, retrofitting or urbanizing Mississauga might be very different from what's happening in Brampton.
Mississauga is simply ahead of Brampton. So Hazel McCallion, whom I worked with in Mississauga, was the queen of sprawl. She basically filled up.
That was her moniker.
That was her moniker. She came from Streetsville. She had been the reeve. That's an old term that you probably haven't heard for a while. She was the reeve of Streetsville. And so she presided over that pattern that we've come to know so well. At some point, she figured out that this wasn't working anymore. And to her great credit, she started to see the opportunity to turn Square One, which is what I worked on, which is this regional mall surrounded by thousands of parking spaces, into a city center. So, a city hall, a living arts center, a library, eventually Sheridan College. All of these civic chess pieces came into Mississauga City Center, along with all of this residential development. And the plan that I worked on was about how you could take this resource, which was all the surface parking lots, and create a pattern of urban streets and blocks so that it could get filled in as neighborhoods with employment and living and walkability, and then pushing for the light rail, which is coming from Port Credit up Huron, Brampton was the next big municipality to the north. While Hazel was making this change, Brampton was still madly pursuing the old paradigm. And Brampton has now caught up, and they have done something called Vision 2040. My colleague Larry Beasley helped them articulate a vision for how they could make the shift. They're getting all-day GO service, 15-minute headways, on the go, 3 GO stations. They've too realized the same thing that Hazel McCallion realized a couple of decades ago, that they had to make the change. And so that is causing them, and I'm working with the city as a kind of strategic advisor with people in all the different departments, mainly attached to urban design in the planning department, but also increasingly, because everything is connected to everything, with all of their colleagues, in how do you change all the practices that were designed to produce a dish that nobody wants anymore? What's the new recipe? And how do you change everything from these gigantic arterials, from the form of development that they were doing, from how they do community hubs, how they get walkability? So our big slogan is 20-minute neighborhoods. How do you convert Brampton in a way that will give people within 20 minutes of where they live the ability to walk to serve all their daily life needs instead of getting into a car? No mean feat, but it can be done. And I'll just go back to Jane Jacobs, because when she wrote the last book before she died, called Dark Age Ahead, she devoted a chapter to suburbia and how suburbia could transform. And she came up with something that has stuck with me ever since. She said, there are so many intractable things about the way the suburbs are designed. There's divisions of property, there are laws, there are regulations. But when the time will come, when the paradigm breaks, when it's no longer useful, which is now, there will be a force majeure, which she identified, that will actually sweep all of that away And that's what we're living through now in pretty much all of the municipalities in the 905.